This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the life and career of Wilt Chamberlain. Is he the greatest basketball player of all time? I will be debating with Tom Eisenberg, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Tom Eisenberg is my guest. I've been looking to do a show on the topic of Wilt Chamberlain because online on most YouTube channels, he is never brought up in the topic of greatest athletes out there, or certainly the greatest in basketball. Usually it's Michael Jordan versus LeBron James. Occasionally you'll get Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or someone else there. But oddly enough, Wilt Chamberlain, who when I was a young boy was inarguably the greatest player of all time, is never brought up anymore. And of a handful of people I tried to get, Tom was the only one willing to go on camera to speak about that claim. So welcome, Tom. I'd like to give my guests a few minutes to give a little bit of background about themselves. If you could tell me who you are, what your interest in sports, are you a sports writer, and anything else you want to talk relevant to the topic.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Tom. I'm currently a grad student at the Walter Cronkite School of Sports Journalism. I went to undergrad at UC Berkeley, where I was a sports reporter for the Daily Californian, and my favorite sport is basketball, obviously. Uh, when I moved to the United States in 2007 from Israel, that's when I discovered basketball because the first friend I made, he was a huge Kobe fan, and so I became a Lakers fan just like him, and I fell in love with basketball that way.
So let's talk about the whole idea of G.O.A.T's greatest of all times. In the last decade or so, this seems to have sort of exploded. Yes, people would talk about in baseball Babe Ruth or Willie Mays or something. And I think one of the things that has driven it, well, the two players that have driven it the most are Michael Jordan, his legacy, and Tom Brady, currently reactivated now on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as the greatest of all time quarterback, if not the greatest of all time football player. Um, what was the first greatest of all time sports debate that you heard? Was it involving Michael Jordan, or was it involving Tom Brady or someone else?
Honestly, I don't know if I remember. It was probably like an overall debate. It was probably like who's like the best American athlete, and it was probably like Jordan or Ali or Phelps or things like that. That sounds about what it would be.
Mm. So you said that you're interested in basketball. That's the sport that you primarily focus on. What was it? The Lakers? Well, no, you said '07, so it would have been, I guess, the Lakers of Kobe and not Kobe and Shaq that got you interested in basketball.
Yeah, just Kobe. I didn't get to see Shaq on the Lakers. I wasn't in the States.
So uh, Kobe, of course, was always compared to Jordan. You only then got to see Jordan, I guess, through clips of him playing. You never saw Jordan play live then.
No, I'm only 23, right? So when he retired, I was 4.
Mm. So uh, regarding Kobe, then that I guess sort of led you into looking into stats. You wanted to, I guess, place Kobe within the pantheon of basketball.
Well, I've always been a huge stats guy because I just like numbers. It's a cool way to quantify the game because you just can't watch it all, right? You can't watch every game and every season. So, when I was probably in middle school, I was like, oh, I want to learn about the history of the game. So I'm going to read all the Wikipedia bios from like everyone in the Hall of Fame. I just went through the Hall of Fame and I clicked on all the Wikipedia files, looked at all their basketball reference pages, and I tried to learn as much as I could. And yeah, I think that was a lot of fun for me.
So, other than Kobe, and I guess was Jordan the first guy you looked up, and then did you go back to see the Kareem Abdul-Jabbars and the Bill Russells and the Wilt Chamberlains?
No, well, what I did was I obviously I looked at Kobe, but I looked at like a lot of the current legends, right? I was like LeBron and Durant, uh, Carmelo, players like that. But I was looking at like records like who had like the most this, and so like oh, Wilt scored like the most points. So like let me look at like all the stuff he did, and then like it blows off the page, and it's like oh, Oscar Robertson, he had averaged a triple double. Or it's like George Mikan averaged 28 in an era where no one else was even averaging like 22, and things like that. That stood out to me.
So, regarding Wilt Chamberlain, probably the closest that you can think of someone who just was rocketed way above. You mentioned George Mikan, Babe Ruth in baseball. I mean, when he started in the 100 years ago, basically, I think the home run record was like 13, and then by the time he was done, he got it up to like 29, 49, 59, and 60. Uh, and then Will comes along, and he blows away just all the basketball records. So it was the records themselves that got you interested in Wilt Chamberlain.
Yeah, I mean, he really just stands off the page. Unlike Basketball Reference, when you lead the league in something,
Mhm.
they bold the stat. So when you look at his Basketball Reference page, like almost every stat is bolded. It's
Mhm.
hilarious.
Yeah. So let's talk about stats because growing up, well, I think in the Russell Chamberlain days of the 60s, I don't think blocks were even a stat, were they?
Now, steals and blocks and turnovers weren't counted till 73, 74.
Yeah. So it's sort of like with sacks in the NFL. The record now, I think, was just tied last year. I forget by
Yeah,
who, but
TJ Watt.
TJ Watt tied Strahan's record, I think, at
Yeah.
22 and a half. But we don't know about Lawrence Taylor or all the guys from the 60s or whatnot. So that kind. Then you get these newest stats. What is your take on stats like PER?
I don't love PER personally. I do like some of the newer stats, right? Because I think it's a cool way to try to quantify the game. I mean, the thing is, right? No one stat is great. Every stat is good at what it's supposed to measure. But even I think John Hollinger made PER. He doesn't like it either. And it's just like it really overvalues low minute players. Like if you're a center who plays like 15 minutes a game
Yeah.
and you get like a good amount of rebounds per minute and blocks, like Mitchell Robinson, right? He's like a solid player, but he doesn't play that many minutes. And because he doesn't miss that much and he's just like gets a lot of blocks, his PR is like through the roof. Or like Boban Marjanovic. So I don't really love that stat because I think it overvalues players with low minutes. But when you do look at like the top players all time in PER, it is a pretty good list, right? It's not like there's going to be, a bunch of randos in there.
Yeah, well, Mitchell Robinson is a good case because I'm a Knicks fan, and I think a year or two ago he set the highest percentage for shooting percentage because basically he's
Yeah,
dunking all
but
the
he
time.
barely took any shots, so
Yeah,
I don't think he should have qualified.
yeah,
He like
yeah,
broke Wilt's record, but he was averaging like 10 points per game. Wilt did it averaging 14, so I think that's ridiculous.
yeah. So with a stat like that, well, for me, it's like pace stats. One of the arguments you hear against uh, older players in the 60s is, well, they were averaging 110, 120 possessions versus like 95 during Jordan's era or something along those lines. But you like you said, you can't scale them up because if you did you could have a guy who's playing 8 minutes a game and averaging 5 points. Well, that would be 30 points prorated to 48 minutes, but it doesn't work like that because their flaws become more obvious the more that they play.
Also, it's tiring, right? People aren't robots. You can't play at the same rate, the same minute every time. So it's like, yeah, we'll being able to play every minute in those fast-paced games, getting hard fouled all the time. Other players can't do that.
So let's talk about something that Bill Russell said. I'm sure you probably have heard of it. There's a well-known clip where Bill Russell is being asked. I think he was arguing with Michael Jordan somewhere, and Jordan was brought up in the early '90s. That famous shot that I think it was Steve Kerr took that won one of their championships. And Bill Russell said, "Well, if you were playing in my day, your team, you wouldn't have won that game." And Jordan said something like, well, what do you mean? And Bill also says, well, in my day, there were only 8 teams and 10 players a team. There were only 80 players. In your day, in Jordan's day, and I think is when we got the 30th team, you had 330 or 300, and now it's up to like 360 players, 12 on a squad. And he said Steve Kerr wouldn't have made the NBA back then because uh, even though I will grant you, modern players have better medicine, better training, et cetera, and better schemes. They can maximize their talent. What you basically had was a much shrunken league. If you only have 80 players, you're going to get the best of the best. And so it's almost like you're playing a playoff game all the time back then.
Yeah, and you have to play every team multiple times in the season, like not like three or four. It was like eight, nine, or 10
Yeah.
because there were so few teams. I do remember that quote. I think he was actually talking about John Paxson,
Oh, that's right.
'93
Paxson. That's right.
finals.
Right.
But yeah, that was a funny one.
So let's talk then about the arguments that are usually made for the greatest of all time. Uh, well, obviously, there's recency bias since we're talking LeBron versus Jordan. Jordan now is as far away from LeBron and the current era as Wilt, well, even more so maybe than Wilt was from his own era. Um, so when you see something like the endless posts about who is better, LeBron or Michael Jordan, um, who do you put else up there in the arguments other than Wilt? That say another one or two.
I like Russell and Kareem too. I
Yeah,
like those five. I don't think you can really go wrong with any of them.
yeah. How would you slot them then?
That's tough. Kind of varies by the day. Uh, I like Wilt a lot, so I'm cool with putting him one. And then, but again, like it's like, do I want totality? Do I want like absolute peak? Because again, it's really hard. I'd probably have Russell last in that five. That's usually my go-to. But like, I don't know. I'd probably go like Wilt, uh, MJ, LeBron, Kareem. I really don't know. That's not. It's just not easy.
Yeah, see, I would go with Wilt, then I'd go with Kareem, then I'd go with LeBron, Michael, and probably Russell. And the reason I do is because one of the things I think that is missing in this greatest of all time debate, especially within basketball, is one-on-one play. Have you ever seen that video where Dr. J and Kareem played a couple of years after both of them retired in the early 90s? And
Yeah,
even though both of them are retired, they're still in relatively good shape. And Kareem dominated. And,
yeah.
you
7
know,
foot two.
right. And I think if you put Wilt against, and the only person who would stand a chance would be Kareem, but in their primes, Wilt would have owned Kareem. He was bigger, he was stronger. But there's no way Michael Jordan or even LeBron could have taken on Wilt and won in one-on-one. And when you
No
talk,
non-center could because they're not strong enough to guard him.
yeah. Um, so let's talk about some of the debate. Well, do you want to make? And I'll ask you: do you want to talk about it as a multiple debate of Wilt versus these other guys, or do you just want to go Wilt versus Michael Jordan?
No, the other guys, right? I think it's a Mount Rushmore, if you will, a five-headed Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
I don't like to like these people are like, oh, player X is so far above everybody else. I don't feel that way.
So let's talk about some of the pros and cons that are usually brought up about these players. Let's start. Let's go from 5 to 1, as I said. So let's start with Bill Russell. The argument for Russell is again, he's the greatest winner, not only in basketball history, but in American sports history. Maybe there's a soccer player that's won more titles over in Asia or something, but in North America, I mean, he's the biggest winner. But when we're talking when we're talking about individuals, we're talking about the individuals. We're not talking about the teams. So, what is your take when people bring up numbers of championships, whether it's Russell or whether it's Tom Brady versus Peyton Manning, say? Um,
I don't like counting rings at all.
yeah,
Like for me, like a player, Michael Jordan could have 0 rings, and I wouldn't look at him differently because I was assuming he played the same way and just lost. I look at how you played, not
mhm,
with the result, because results-oriented thinking I think is stupid. Because you look at some of these players how they play and they lose, right? Like Jerry West in 1969 and they lost. How can you blame him for that? Or LeBron in 2018 or 17. How can you blame those players for losing those series? Like it's a team sport.
yeah, yeah. I know
So I
it.
don't really care that Russell has 11 championships, right? Like obviously like I can't like ignore it. I do have him in my top 5. He's obviously a very impactful player, but I'm not going to put him as my GOAT just because like, oh, 11 rings, like that's just it's not logical.
So, for example, and I think you might have mentioned there's a website called stathead.com.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they have a page, Wilt Chamberlain versus Bill Russell. And just to give you an example, they played 94 times in the regular season. Russell won 57, lost 37. So obviously his teams were significantly better. You're talking about, 3 out of every 5 games they won over nearly 100 games. But if you look at their statistics, and this is in the regular season, Russell averaged a little over 14 points a game. Wilt was just shy of 30. Rebounds 28 to 22. Assists, Russell had half an assist more. And in just about every other major statistic, Chamberlain dominates. And it amazes me that you can look at that and you'll get the Russell and Celtic fans saying, well, he was just letting Will score so his team could win, which makes absolutely no sense. What is your
Yeah,
take on when you see such an obvious statistical disparity and people still arguing?
because people just want it's I forgot the name for it, but it's people want to believe what they there's a word for this. People believe what they want to believe, and so they just like kind of make up whatever they want, being like, oh, because I want to believe this is greater than this guy, then like I'm gonna create up this logic that makes it make sense. Where it's like, oh, Russell's better because he's a better teammate and he's a winner, right? He beat him. It doesn't matter if his stats are obviously way worse and he obviously can't do the things Wilt does.
Mm. Well, and that's an interesting thing when we get back to Michael Jordan. Uh, People will say, well, Will Chamberlain only won two titles. Yet the two teams that he won set the league record at the time for most wins in a season, best record.
Yeah, 68 and 69.
And he was asked by his coach to totally change his game in the second half of his career, not score all the time, pass, rebound, play defense, and he did that. Still playing, 45 minutes or so a game, and people forget that Peyton Manning only won two Super Bowls. No one's saying Peyton Manning is one of the top three or four quarterbacks of all time.
People
Then
do
they'll
say that.
what?
People say that about Peyton Manning. I see Peyton Manning compared to Wilt a lot.
Yeah, and the thing though is you look at Jordan and they'll say, well, he was 6-0 in the finals and whatnot. Yeah, but they forget all the three consecutive years they got destroyed by the Pistons before they became a good team, and yet somehow Jordan escapes the blame for that. They'll say, well, he didn't have Pippen. Well, Wilt didn't have a lot of players when he was losing all the times to the Celtics. And when he did have the teams to compete, he did win two titles. He lost a couple of times in the finals to the Knicks and one other team, I think. Uh, but what is your take when people use those selective judgments? Jordan, 6-0 in the finals, but like I said, he lost in the playoffs too.
No, it's just the same thing. It's just people using whatever arguments they can to boost their own agendas, right? Like they don't care about logic when you do stuff like that. Like nobody cares about finals record. It's a team sport. Like it's such a stupid argument.
So let's then move up. Number four, I would have had you on. So let's go. Number three, I had LeBron. So let's talk about LeBron. Then we'll talk about the two big guys at the end. So in the debate usually between Jordan and LeBron, you get that the 6-0 finals record versus LeBron is what 3-5. That's what was he three
He's
and
4-6.
4-6. Okay, so he's 4-6 in the finals, but he's also won with three different teams, three
Yeah.
different franchises. Uh, and people say, well, he went and he built his team or whatnot. Yeah, but Michael stayed when he had a team
Yeah,
around
because
him.
his front office gave him the team. Like LeBron was playing with Anderson Varejao and Larry Hughes. Like you can't win a title with that.
So another, I was in an argument once about with on a guy with a website called Quora about one of the myths about Jordan is how clutch he is. And there was also another, I think it was another stathead.com page, or was a similar site, which claimed that in terms of game winning shots and whatnot, that LeBron is actually better. So it seems to me that when in this argument, which is the argument that is the dominant one, Michael versus LeBron, the other guys are sort of rarely put up there, but that Michael somehow never missed a shot. He was always clutch, and yet if you look at the statistics, LeBron is more clutch.
Yeah, I mean, and you can see it too. Like you saw in that 2018 playoff run, the whole season, like he was just hitting game winner after game winner. Not that Michael Jordan isn't clutch, but like people just say LeBron's not clutch because of 2011. But other than that, like he's been very clutch.
Now, the hardest thing in basketball to really determine, and in all sports other than football, is defense. If you look at the defensive stats of baseball players, one stat will say a guy is a butcher in the field. The next stat will say that he's almost a Gold Glover. Um, and other than steals and maybe block shots, it's a much harder to determine the defensive capabilities of a player. Now, there's no doubt in my mind, for example, that if you look at Michael Jordan play before he retired, after the first three-peat he had, he was certainly a great defensive player. He won the Defensive Player of the Year. He was on like 8 or 9 Defensive Player of the Year teams. But if you look at when he came back a couple of years later, he lost a step. And again, I'm a Knick fan, so someone might say I'm biased, but I mean, he was never the same defensive player. You look at LeBron, though. Yes, he's not the defensive player he was 5 or 10 years ago, but he still guards more than guards. Jordan only guarded the guards, and they always put Scottie Pippen on the best offensive player. They didn't put Jordan on the best offensive player they were against. What is your take on defense and how that figures into the arguments of people like LeBron versus Jordan?
That's tough. I think offense is obviously like the most important part of the game, and it's usually what people look at. Because again, defense is harder to quantify. Like, it's really hard to definitively say player X is a definitively better defender than player Y, right? Unless like the gap is like very obvious. Like, and there's different roles on defense, so it's like Michael Jordan, he's more of like a point of attack defender. LeBron James is more of a help defender. It's like who's better at their role? I don't know. Like, that's not an easy thing to say. People just look at all defensive teams and be like, oh, Jordan has 9, I think it's 9, and LeBron, or maybe it's 8, and LeBron has 6, and it's like, well, that's not smart. LeBron should have made way more than 6.
Yeah, and another thing, when people talk about the Wilts and the Russells, they always talk about the gap between the Jordan years. But like I said, the 80s and 90s are actually closer to the 60s and 70s when Wilt was in his prime than they are now to LeBron in his prime. Yet they don't use the same arguments going backwards for Wilt versus, say, Michael Jordan compared to Jordan versus LeBron.
No, they don't. They act like the 60s was like 100 years before.
Yeah. So let's get to the big guys, Kareem and Wilt. So Kareem Abdul-Jabbar first. He is the all-time scorer in terms of just raw points, not points per game or leading the league in this statistic average per game. Uh, he 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 certainly is, I think, a great player. And like I said, he dominated after Wilt in the mid '70s as one of the great runs, not including Wilt's first 7 seasons where he led the league. What is your take on Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, just statistically?
Honestly, he's kind of an anomaly, or at least he was. Now, kind of LeBron's kind of the same way, where it was like he was really good for a long time. Like he had like all the longevity records, right? I mean, he's still the all-time leading scorer for now for regular season, but like he has like the most All-Star teams and like the most All NBA teams, and like I think like the most seasons averaging at least 20 points. And it was like, wow, like how is he like still going? Like at 38, like he won a Finals MVP, and and he still had like a really dominant prime. Like 70s Kareem is up there as good as anybody. And so that was really tough to match for anyone. And now LeBron's basically doing the same thing, but like bringing it up a level.
So, what is the argument that you have seen most when people exclude someone like Kareem from these debates?
That he couldn't win without Magic. That's generally what I hear. Or without a great point guard, right? Because he won with Oscar while he was still good. And then without Oscar, he didn't do anything until Magic came along. And I mean, I guess that's fair, but I don't care about winning championships like that because again, we're ranking individuals in a team sport. So how can you put so much emphasis on championships when it requires a team? Like you look at like the '04 Pistons, right? That's a team that won a championship, and none of those players are like top tier all timers.
Yeah.
But because of that one championship, you're gonna put any of those players above someone like Karl Malone who never won a championship? No, it's stupid.
And then yet they never say anything about Jordan's never winning a title without Pippen. And it's
Yeah,
yeah,
because he played his whole career with him basically.
yeah,
If there was a period, like a longer period, where Jordan didn't play, like if Pippen left in 1993 and Jordan came back and then didn't win those titles because Pippen wasn't there, maybe then it'd be a talking point. But because it was only like the early years, they just give him a pass.
yeah. And interestingly too, just about an hour or so ago before we started talking, I saw this video. A guy did NBA Miss, and he said that there's a myth that Jordan would have won 8 straight titles if he hadn't retired, and the year that Jordan came back, right in '95, he played only half a season, and people say, well, he was rusty. He wasn't that good. That's why they didn't win the title. But then he showed the statistics. Jordan was better in the '95 playoffs statistically than he was in the '96 playoffs when he won 72 games and the fourth title. And it's just another idea where people manipulate statistics for their own ends rather than just looking raw at them. Now, I'm not saying that statistics are everything. There is a certain eye test sometimes that can't be statistically quantified. But what is your take on that?
I mean, he had a 55-point game that season. Like he was fine.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's very stupid. Like they legitimately lost. Like they lost. I don't know. I don't want to hear excuses. Like he was playing. You know, like those same people will make fun of LeBron for losing the first round last year when he was hobbling on one ankle. So I don't want to hear it.
Yeah, and it's like people, and Scottie Pippen is famously on the outs with Michael Jordan now, and people will say, well, without Jordan, Pippen didn't win, in '94, but yet the Bulls did win what, 55 games,
Yeah, they
and
only lost two fewer games, and they would have made the conference finals if it wasn't for that terrible call.
and if you look, at the records that Jordan had before Pippen, they were never as good as with him. Now, of course, there were more good players on those Bulls teams, but people don't reckon that when they talk about this kind of thing. So let's talk then about Wilt, since that's the main focus here. We've mentioned statistically how good he was, but I want to talk about before he even got into basketball, because I would argue that I think Wilt Chamberlain is probably the greatest athlete of the 20th century. If you look in college, he was a track and field superstar. The guy is 7'1" barefoot, and yet he famously outran Jim Brown, who was the greatest running back of the '60s and '70s. Some would even say still the greatest NFL running back. Uh, Arnold Schwarzenegger has said that he could lift 600 pounds. I don't know if that's true, but he could bench press 600 pounds. That he had a 48-inch vertical leap, that he could take leap and pluck quarters off the top of a backboard. What is your take on these sort of mythic things and those that have been documented?
I just wish we could verify them, to be honest. Like I kind of take them with a grain of salt, right? Like I'll take what like something like that doesn't have like a real like fact with it, and I'll be like, okay, it's probably like 75% true, right? So it's like if he says he like a 48-inch vertical, it's probably like a 40-inch vertical. 600 pounds, he probably bench like 450. So that's how I look at it, but we never really know.
So I mentioned earlier some of things like per and pace stats and why they are not the best ways to measure things. Um, Let me ask you, since you're very statistically inclined, what are the 3 or 4 most statistical anomalies that show the greatness of Wilt Chamberlain just on a basketball court? Is it the 50 points per game for a year? Is it I think 26 or 27 rebounds a game per game in one year? Is it leading the league in assists one year as a center? What stands out to you?
I think it's the combination of all of them, because in theory, you think any great player could like if they, I mean not necessarily could, but it's something that like could be plausible, right? Where it's like, okay, a player is like taking so many shots, maybe they can average 50 points per game, or I get the rebounds is really not possible just because like there's the pace really affected that. The rebounds, there was like 75 rebounds a game in the 60s, and now there's like 50. So that's really absurd. That's very air dependent. That's why like the top like 20 players in rebounds per game all time are all from like the 60s. But I think the combination of everything that like all the records Wilt has is really what makes him special, because like, oh, he has 7 scoring titles, including like the top like 3 or 4 seasons ever. He has like 7 of the top 10 rebounding seasons. He's the only center to ever average over 8 assists per game in a season. Jokic is at 8 right now, so we'll see if he joins that list. And then Wilt also had the field goal percentage record. and he also was the first player to hit 30,000 points. Like, there's just so many, there's things like that will come to mind, I'm sure, in seconds, but it's just absurd. 48 and a half minutes per game. Like, who does that?
Yeah. So, who you mentioned Jokic. Whenever there's a record or people talk about they're going to break a record, it's usually a record that Wilt holds. Uh, in the 50 years since Wilt basically retired, or almost 50 years, 48, whatever it is, who do you think is the player? Well, let's. Who do you think is the center that comes closest, and who do you think is the player other than Jordan that could give a run that we haven't discussed yet as the greatest of all time? You know, someone who's under.
Honestly, I really like Jokic.
Yeah.
Like, this year, Jokic is breaking so many records. I actually wrote about him for an assignment for class. Uh, like right now, Jokic has a PER of like 33, and the season's basically over. Like,
And
so y'all,
let me just ask before you go on. Can you explain the PER? What statistics is that sort of like baseball WAR? I mean, I've looked at what they say, you know, and I look at WAR in baseball. And I'm like, I've got problems with that. But what is PER
it's
per?
like a box score stat accumulator, basically. That's about as much as I know
Yeah.
because like I'm not like a super math whiz, right? I'm not gonna like understand the whole equation, but that's the gist that I get from it.
So it's sort of like the quarterback ratings that the NFL has. You know, I think a 148 or something is the top you can get or something.
Well, in PER, I don't think there's a maximum you can have, right? I
Yeah.
think if a player like scored a bat was 1 for 1 in a basket and played 1 second, his PER would be like 100. I don't know if there's a max. Um, but Jokic right now, Giannis too. Giannis broke Wilt's record 2 years ago, his PR record, and Giannis right now is on pace to break it again. But Jokic is on pace to break that one by even more. So Jokic is just insane, right? He's averaging 27 points, almost 14 rebounds, 8 assists, and he's shooting almost 60% from the field. And he makes over a three a game and shoots 83% from the line. Like, and he's 26 years old. Like, he could do this for another 10 years. He's not relying on athleticism. Like, I can't see him not cracking the top 10 ever. Like, he has to.
Well, you just mentioned the free throws. Now that's the probably the biggest. Let's talk about some of the flaws that people bring up about Wilt. The most obvious one, of course, is free throws. I think he's something at like 61% free throw.
I
Or
think it's 50%.
is 50? Yeah, or
It's
50,
pretty bad.
and he's like a half a percentage point under Shaq, who is the modern day
Yeah.
equivalent. Um, uh, but the other things that they will say about him is, for example, and in that Quora forum that I was arguing on, they'll talk about, I think it was in 68 or 69 when Wilt went the whole quarter against, I believe it was the Knicks, and he didn't even take a shot. Now I remember very vaguely as a boy watching that, and I always was under the impression that his coach, who was I forget who was the coach of the Lakers at the time, told him not to take shots, to keep feeding it. What is your take on that? Those weaknesses, other than the free throws.
Yeah, well, in 69, right, they faced the Celtics, and I think it was Van Bredikoff. I think that was his name.
Okay, yeah,
Something like
yeah.
that.
Butch
He was
Van
obsessed with
Bredikoff.
Jerry West.
Yeah,
He low-key, he might have just been racist. I really don't know. But, and he was just wanting Jerry West to shoot every shot. That's why Jerry West averaged like 40 something in that finals. And Wilt was averaging like 13 because it was just like, oh, just feed Jerry West. And he benched Wilt in the finals in that game because Wilt got hurt. And so Wilt went to the bench, and
yeah.
when Wilt was like, okay, I'm ready to go back in, he wouldn't put him back in. And then they went to overtime and they lost. Um, so that coach really just screwed the Lakers that season. That's why he got fired immediately. And then they got Bill Sharman, and he was a big help.
And there's also the series when the Knicks won their first title in 69 70,
70.
and Willis Reed outplayed Wilt. I don't remember that as much as the one we just mentioned. What My only argument would be, well, people have bad series, people have bad games. I mean, Wilt was a human being. It's not like Michael Jordan didn't have bad games in the playoffs or whatnot. What is your take on that? Willis Reed outplaying Wilt and this somehow disqualifying him from being the greatest of all time.
I mean, I think it's objectively, it's false. Like, if you look at the numbers for the series, right, they average the same amount of points. Wilt averaged more rebounds, way more rebounds, like over double the rebounds, more assists, and he shot better from the field. And Willis Reed also at the end of that series, right, he got injured and he was terrible. Like the last 3 games, I think he scored under 10 points total. I'm gonna double check this right now, but like after he injured his knee in the beginning of game 6, like he was awful. He scored 11 points in the last 2 games. So yeah, he did outplay Wilt in those first few games, but then in the last 2 games that the Knicks won because of Walt Frazier, Willis Reed gets crowned Finals MVP, and people say he outplayed Wilt. When Walt Frazier is the reason they won that series.
Yeah, that I do remember. Frazier had a great series. Another one that comes up is uh, I think it was in '71 against the Bucks when Kareem, then known as Lou Alcindor played against Will. Now Alcindor did have the better stats as I recall in that series. I think that
Yeah, I mean
was
he was better at that
yeah,
time.
yeah, in the Western Finals. But in the last game or two, I do remember, and I remember this vividly. People always talk about the skyhook as the most devastating, unblockable shot. I remember there was one sequence when Wilt twice blocked it, and then when they came back, no, he blocked it once, and then they came back and he blocked it. He blocked it like 3 times within a minute and a half. And this was when Wilt was on his last legs, literally as a player. He was hobbling around, and he still was able to call up that stuff. And it's like, what more does this guy have to do? He there's a famous interview that you've probably seen where Will says, if I knew there was going to be some goddamn debate, he said I would have scored 60 that first season. Put these records so far out of league. But talk if you will about that series, the first one with Kareem and Alcindor and Wilt.
I just wish I got to watch that. Honestly, that would have been really cool. The Lakers were at a huge disadvantage, right? I mean, Elgin Baylor was totally washed. I don't think he played at all. Jerry West didn't play at all. He got injured in those playoffs. So it was really just Wilt by himself against the juggernaut 71 Bucks. I mean, they were the number one overall seed. Like the Lakers were not going to win. I think that series went 6. It might have
Yeah,
been 5.
yeah,
I want to double check because I can't remember everything off the top of my
yeah.
head. But honestly, we'll put up a pretty good fight, but he wasn't gonna match like peak Kareem. Yeah, like the Lakers that season won 48 games, missing Jerry West a lot, and the Bucks won 66 games.
Yeah.
Like they were favored probably anyways, and without Jerry West, it was no contest. But Wilt did held his own, right? Kareem, he held him way under his averages. He only averaged 25 a game, shot under 50%, and Wilt averaged he nearly matched it, 22 points per game, 49% from the field. Pretty impressive for a 34-year-old.
Now, one other thing in the Wilt law that again I do remember, and in the 1970s, I don't know if you know, but basketball was not nearly as popular until Magic and Bird came along. A lot of these playoff games would be recorded and then
Tape
broadcast.
delay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, overnight almost. I think it was the '71 or '72 All Star game, and I forget who it was. It might I think Walt Bellamy was retired by then, but someone went in for a shot, and I think it was from the right side. And Wilt Chamberlain I, jumped higher than anyone I've seen. I think there's a still shot of it, and it's straight on, so it's not perspective. Where his hand is about a foot and a half above the rim, and he blocks it. And this is in the All Star game. Again, he's 33 or 34 years old, and it's just an exhibition game. Have you ever seen that
I
clip?
think I have seen that clip.
Yeah,
I don't remember who that was. I think it was a guard, right? Wasn't it like a guard?
yeah, it was a smaller guy, but he
Yeah.
was about 5 feet away from him, so he wasn't right on top of him. And it's just one of the most amazing plays. And this gets back to the when people, you mentioned Giannis, they call him the Greek freak, or with the upcoming NFL draft, everyone's a freak. He's a freak athlete, he's a freak runner, he's a freak receiver, But Will Chamberlain was doing things that no one has done before. What is your take on him, his overall athleticism? And do you think if he hadn't gotten injured, he would have what would have what would have been his stats in the second half of his career?
I mean, I think a lot of that was just because he changed his role.
Yeah,
Uh, I think he's probably the greatest athlete to ever play basketball. I would love to see him play today. I think it'd be really cool. See how long he can play, right? Instead of playing 48 minutes a game, right? Play like 37 minutes a game. Instead of maybe 14 years, you play maybe like 22. That would be really interesting to see.
So you mentioned Jokic, and nowadays, sort of the Russell Wilt rivalry is embodied by Embiid and Jokic. The last couple of years, they've basically been the two biggest big men. Their stats are usually very similar. Similar. Um, what is your take on those two? Just to give a little perspective on the Wilt Russell thing.
I think Jokic is a lot better. Embiid's really good, but Embiid, he's mostly just relying on the free throw line. Like you see all these games where he goes like 5 for 17, and he has 30 points because he took 20 free throws. And I think it's absurd. And honestly, I hate it.
So,
Sometimes he has really good games, like legitimately, but he's like James Harden, but a center.
so let's since well before I broaden out a little bit, what is there anything else you'd like to say about Wilt Chamberlain in defense of the claim that he is the best basketball player of all time that we haven't talked about yet? Is there any stat that you can point to we haven't mentioned?
Um, I just think it's important not to like dismiss the people saying that like everyone in the '60s was bad at basketball. They can only dribble with their right hand. Like everyone was like 5'9" and white. Like those things are just not true. And like it just takes basic research to figure out why. Like there was a palming rule that was strictly enforced. That didn't get stopped being enforced till like probably like the early mid '70s. And so it was you couldn't like do flashy dribble moves, right? That's why Bob Cousy dribbles the way he does. But like look, like you could see like the things that he does despite those rules. It's really impressive. I think he'd be able to do a lot if he had the freedom to dribble like players do today. So things like that, like the average height, there were a lot of 7 footers,
Yeah,
right? And basically every great center in that era was at least 6'9". Like even like today, right? Like who is 7 feet tall? That's good.
yeah.
Like Embiid, that's it, right? Everyone else is good. Like they're not 7 feet tall. Jokic is like 6'10". Anthony Davis is 6'10". Giannis is 6'11". Like those guys are all shorter than Will. Like if it was just all about height, Kristaps Porzingis would be the best player in the league.
Yeah.
Like it's stupid.
And it's interesting because I've seen videos debunking that that in last season the average height of the NBA center was like no the average the NBA player was like 6'7", and in 66, 67 it was 6'6". So as in 50 plus years, there's only an inch difference. You're going to tell me that's going to make such a big difference?
No, it's so
Will
stupid.
but you did bring up a good point, and this gets back to Jordan. Um, I remember in the '80s watching it. Michael Jordan got more favoritism, I think, than any other player that ever existed. Palming the ball, traveling. Uh, if he, if someone boxed him out or something, they would be called for a foul. Yet Jordan, there was that famous. There was the famous was it 91, 92, the Knicks, the fellow who was going up for the layup. Charles, who I forget, but he basically mugged by Jordan and Pippen, and no fouls were called. Um, do you think a lot? This is the point. Do you think a lot of the Jordan worship is because of his undoubted necessity financially for the NBA to succeed post Magic and post Bird, that because they were so dependent upon him that he's basically untouchable?
I mean, I think that's what the NBA wanted, right? Like David Stern was like, "Oh, refs like basically just let Jordan do whatever, like call every foul on him and stuff, because like he's the golden child." And they don't really do that today, except for like Embiid. I don't understand why Embiid gets so many calls. Like nobody else gets calls like that. He has like the highest free throw rate ever. It's ridiculous. Like none of the other superstars get protected like this. Like I don't see like Jokic or Curry or LeBron or Durant like get calls like this. It's unreal. I'm sorry, I'm going on a tangent on Embiid. He just annoys me.
So let's just wrap this up. Let me just ask you a couple more questions. Uh, we've talked about the eras, the '60s versus the '80s, '90s versus the last decade or so. What is your take on those three eras?
The '60s, '70s,
Yeah,
80s, 90s, and
yeah,
today.
yeah. The difference is the pros and how you could
I
make
mean, they
sense
each
of it.
have their own benefits, right? Like, I love watching today's basketball. Like, I love like the spacing is fun, and I like how like basically any player is bound to go off, right? Like players like you've never heard of can like just pop off and like hit a bunch of threes. Like Anthony Simons really broke out this year when Damian Lillard got hurt, and that was cool. I don't feel like you would have seen that as much in the past. Uh, but now, right, there's more player movement, so the teams aren't as cohesive. Like in the 90s, right, it was like every season it was like rematches because like the teams were mostly the same. I think that was nice. And in the 60s, right, teams were really the same, right, because like players really couldn't leave and they faced each other so many times. So rivalries were really intense, and there were a lot of players that I wish I got to see.
And I guess I'll end before giving you a final say on whatever you want. The last thing I would say is, uh, so you mentioned Jokic. Do you think that he's going to be in the conversation? Do you think he's going to bump Bill Russell from that five-headed Mount Rushmore in 10 years?
I mean, he definitely could. I mean, it all depends on how he plays. I mean, like if he has like this season like 10 more times, then like yeah, definitely. Like this is insane what he's doing.
But yet statistically, it's not as big an outlier as Wilt. It's more refined statistics, isn't it?
I mean, on the basic box score, maybe, but no one's. It's still stats no one's ever matched. And on the advanced side, like it's quite an outlier. I mean, Will, like, I don't really expect people to like put outlier stats like Will. Like no one's like he's not gonna play. He's only playing 33 minutes a game, right? He's not gonna play 48 minutes and take a billion shots. And the rebounds is like I said, that's not possible. But otherwise, right? Like you don't see players doing this.
And it just occurred to me. So, do you think if Wilt was playing in today's game, and assuming that he had the modern medicine and health, training and whatnot, um, forget about the individual stats. Do you think he would be more appreciated in this era?
Yeah, because then because the reason he gets disrespected is because they didn't see him, so they just assume he was good because he's tall.
Yeah.
So and they would see that he's awesome, and he would just destroy people. He'd be like a gazelle on the court. He's 7'1", dunking on dudes. Like he'd be like a better version of Giannis, and I think people would really like that.
And finally, then I want to thank you for spending the better part of an hour speaking about this. Is there anything else you want to say about the game of basketball or Will Chamberlain?
No,
No?
I think we covered it all.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Tom. And I will link to your. You have a Twitter page, I believe, don't you?
Yeah, I do.
I'll link
It's
to. I'll link to
at
that. Oh,
T
go ahead.
Eisenberg.
Okay, I'll link to that. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks, Dan.